There is a sentence that Augustine of Hippo wrote sometime around the year 397 that changed the history of Western Christianity. It is a prayer, 6 words in Latin, and it goes like this: "Give me what you command, and command what you will." Read it slowly, because if you have ever tried to change something real about yourself, if you have ever known exactly what you should do and still not been able to do it, if you have ever gone to bed at night and made a promise to yourself that did not survive contact with the next morning, then that sentence is about you. It was about Augustine, too. He wrote it from the deepest place in his experience, from years of knowing what he should want and wanting something else instead, from the particular exhaustion of a man who had tried to be different and kept failing and finally concluded that trying was not the problem and trying harder was not the solution. It is one of the most honest sentences anyone has ever written about what it feels like to be a human being. And when a monk named Pelagius heard it read aloud in a room in Rome, he felt something close to alarm. Not because it was dishonest, because of what it would do to people who believed it. What followed that moment was one of the strangest and most consequential conflicts in the history of Christianity. A conflict between 2 men who both believed in God, both believed in grace. Both believed that human beings were called to something higher than what they usually managed. A conflict that was not really about theology, or not only about theology, but about something more fundamental: what human beings actually are, what they are capable of, what they require from outside themselves. Whether the distance between who you are and who you know you should be is a distance you can cross, or a distance that can only be crossed for you. Augustine spent the last 30 years of his life fighting to make sure that Pelagius's answer to that question was never heard again. He almost succeeded. This is the story of what Pelagius asked, what Augustine heard inside the asking, and what both of them were really fighting about when they fought about grace. It is also, whether you know it or not, a story about you. Rome, in the late 4th century, was a city that had learned to wear Christianity like a piece of jewelry. Constantine had made the faith legal decades earlier. Theodosius had made it official. The empire had converted. On paper. In ceremony. In the names it gave its children and the symbols it carved into its public buildings. Churches had replaced temples. Bishops had replaced priests. The old gods were gone, or at least they had changed their names. But walk through the streets of Rome in those years, and what you saw was not a city that had been transformed. What you saw was a city that had been renamed. The wealthy families attended Mass on Sunday and ran their slaves the rest of the week with the same casual brutality they always had. The men who sat in the front rows of the basilicas and listened to sermons about humility went home to houses with more rooms than most people would see in a lifetime. The faith that had begun among fishermen and outcasts in a backwater province had, within 3 centuries, become the preferred religion of the people who owned everything. A monk from Britain watched all of this and felt something he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. His name was Pelagius. We do not know exactly when he was born, or where in Britain he came from, or what his family looked like, or what made him leave the island at the far northwestern edge of the known world and travel to the center of it. The historical record on Pelagius is thin in ways that will matter more as this story goes on. What we know is that he arrived in Rome sometime in the 380s, that he was a monk with a serious reputation for personal discipline, and that he had eyes that would not let him look away from things other people had learned to stop seeing. Rome was one of those things. He was not the first person to notice the gap between what the church preached and how its members lived. That gap has existed as long as there have been churches. What made Pelagius different was the conclusion he drew from it. Most reformers look at a church full of comfortable sinners and conclude that the preaching needs to be louder, the discipline stricter, the consequences more visible. Pelagius looked at the same church and asked a different question entirely. He asked why. Not why were people sinning. That was obvious enough. He asked why the church seemed to have quietly accepted that they would. Why the sermons calling people to holiness were delivered with the tone of someone reading from a menu they did not expect anyone to order from. Why the gap between the ideal and the reality had become so wide that no one seemed embarrassed by it anymore. The answer he kept arriving at was one that would define the rest of his life and end his career. People were not trying because they had been told, in ways subtle and direct, that trying was not really the point, that human beings were too broken, too compromised, too weighed down by something inherited from the very beginning of the species, for their effort to matter very much. That what God required was not transformation but belief, not change but confession, not becoming different people but belonging to the right community, and trusting that grace would cover the distance between who they were and who they were supposed to be. Pelagius thought this was wrong, the way a structural error is wrong. The kind of mistake that does not just produce bad results in one place but undermines everything built on top of it. And he thought it was dangerous in proportion to how widely it was believed. He began to teach, quietly at first, in the way that monks teach, through conversation and correspondence and the slow accumulation of a reputation for saying things that were difficult to dismiss. Rome in the late 4th century was full of people with opinions about theology. It was a city where ideas had consequences, where the right argument in the right ear could shape policy, where the wrong argument in the wrong ear could end a career. Pelagius understood this. He was not a naive man. He was also, by every account that survives, a genuinely impressive one. Jerome, who would later become one of his most vicious critics, initially described him as a man of considerable learning and serious moral discipline. Augustine himself, in the early years, before the conflict hardened into something permanent, referred to him with a respect that would later become complicated. Even the people who ended up hating Pelagius had difficulty explaining away the fact that he lived exactly the life he preached. He was lean where Rome was fat. He was disciplined where Rome was comfortable. He asked nothing of his followers that he did not ask of himself first and more severely. This matters because what Pelagius was doing in Rome was not the project of a hypocrite or a careerist. He was a man who genuinely believed that human beings were capable of more than they were being told, who was willing to live that belief at significant personal cost, and who could not understand why the most powerful religious institution in the world seemed so comfortable telling people the opposite. Then came the sentence. It arrived without any announcement of its own significance. Pelagius was in Rome, in the company of people who moved in the same theological circles he did, when someone read aloud from a new work by a bishop in North Africa. The bishop's name was Augustine of Hippo. The work was his Confessions, a document of almost frightening self-disclosure in which one of the most brilliant minds of the age laid out the story of his own failure, his own longing, his own inability to become the person he knew he should be. The sentence that stopped Pelagius was the prayer you heard at the beginning of this story. Give me what you command, and command what you will. In the room where it was read, people received it the way beautiful things are received when they arrive unexpectedly, with recognition, with something close to relief. Here was a man who understood the weight of what God asked of human beings, and who had the honesty to say that the asking and the being able to do it were not the same thing. Pelagius did not feel relief. He felt the specific alarm of a man who has spent years watching a particular kind of damage accumulate in a particular kind of community, and who has just heard the theological justification for that damage being read aloud to an appreciative audience. Because here is what that prayer does if you take it seriously. If God must give you what he commands before you can do it, then the command itself becomes secondary, almost decorative. You hear it. You acknowledge you cannot fulfill it alone. You ask for grace, and you wait. The doing is God's work. Your work is the asking. Pelagius had watched what this produced in the churches of Rome. He had watched people receive absolution and return to the same lives. He had watched the comfortable and the powerful sit in those basilicas week after week and walk out unchanged. Not because they were unusually wicked, but because the version of the faith they had been handed had quietly removed the expectation of genuine transformation from the center of what it asked. He walked out of that room carrying a question he had not walked in with. If God commands human beings to be holy, and if that command comes from a God who is perfectly good and perfectly just, then the command must be possible to obey. God does not demand what cannot be done. That would not be justice. That would be cruelty dressed in the language of love. And if the command is possible to obey, then something has gone deeply wrong in a Christianity that tells people to stop trying and start asking. He did not know, as he walked back into the noise of Rome that evening, that the man who had written that prayer was going to spend the next 30 years of his life making sure Pelagius's answer to it would never be heard. He did not know it because at that moment, Augustine of Hippo had not yet heard of him either. But he would. And when he did, the question that Pelagius was carrying would stop being a quiet theological disagreement between two serious men. It would become a war. There is a letter that survives from Pelagius to a young woman named Demetrius. Written sometime around the year 413, Demetrius was the daughter of one of the great aristocratic families of Rome. She was young. She was wealthy. She was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person who did not need to make difficult choices, because difficult choices were something that happened to other people. And then, at the moment when her family had arranged a marriage that would have secured her position at the very top of Roman society, she refused it. She chose instead to dedicate her life to celibacy and religious practice. Her decision sent a ripple through the Christian community that was larger than you might expect from one young woman's personal choice. In a world where religious commitment was largely inherited and largely comfortable, a girl from one of Rome's most powerful families voluntarily giving up everything that world had to offer was the kind of thing that made people pay attention. Her mother wrote to Jerome. Her mother wrote to Augustine. Both of them wrote back with letters of spiritual direction and encouragement. Pelagius also wrote to her, and his letter is different from theirs in a way that tells you almost everything you need to know about what he believed and why it terrified Augustine. Augustine's letter to Demetrius is warm, careful, and very much concerned with the dangers of pride. He warns here, gently but persistently, against trusting in her own virtue, against believing that her choice was the product of her own strength, against anything that might lead her to think that what she had done came from herself rather than from God's grace working in her. It is a letter that wants to make sure she knows where her goodness comes from. It comes from outside her. Pelagius's letter begins somewhere else entirely. He tells her that the first thing she needs to understand about herself is that she was made good. Not just potentially good, not good if God intervenes. Good. The capacity for virtue, he writes, was placed in human beings at creation by a God who knew exactly what he was doing. This is not a compliment. This is an argument. He is telling her that what she did in refusing that marriage was not a miracle from outside herself. It was her will, her choice, her nature operating the way human nature was designed to operate when it is taken seriously. He writes that he does not want her to underestimate what God has given to human beings, because underestimating it is its own kind of ingratitude. To say that you cannot be good without God doing the good through you is to treat the image of God in which you were made as something that barely survived the fall, something so damaged that it can only be a vehicle for external power rather than a genuine moral agent in its own right. The letter is extraordinary, not because it is radical, but because it is reasonable. Every sentence in it follows from the one before. Every argument is one that a thoughtful person could follow without specialized training. And at the center of it is a claim so simple that it sounds almost trivially obvious until you follow it to where it leads. The claim is this: God commands. Therefore, human beings can obey. To say anything else Pelagius believed, was to make God into either a liar or a tyrant. A God who commands what cannot be done is not asking for obedience. He is staging a demonstration of inadequacy. He is setting up a system in which the point is not the commandment, but the failure to keep it. Not the law, but the grace that covers the breaking of it. And Pelagius could not read his Bible and find that God. What he found instead was a God who said things like, "Choose this day whom you will serve." A God who, through the prophets, spoke to people as though their choices had weight. A God who, in the teaching of Jesus, said things like, "Be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Not as a cruel joke, but as a genuine direction. A God who, in the letters of Paul, urged communities towards specific behaviors with the tone of someone who expected those behaviors to actually be possible. This was the God Pelagius believed in. And it was a God that required something from the people who claimed to follow him. Not just belief, not just belonging, actual transformation, actual change. The kind of change that showed up in how you treated the people around you, in what you did with your money, in the gap between your private life and your public one. He was not naive about how hard this was. His own life was evidence that he understood the difficulty. The discipline he maintained was not the discipline of someone who found virtue easy. It was the discipline of someone who found it worth the cost of making it difficult. Day after day, without exception. But he also believed that difficulty and impossibility were not the same thing. And he believed that telling people they were impossible had consequences. Consequences he could see in the churches of Rome. In the behavior of people who had been taught that the distance between who they were and who God called them to be was a distance that only grace could cross. And who had drawn from that teaching the very reasonable conclusion that their own effort was not really the variable that mattered. What Pelagius was fighting against was not Augustine specifically. Not yet. He was fighting against a tendency in Christian thinking that he had watched produce a particular kind of spiritual passivity in people who were otherwise perfectly capable of moral seriousness. A tendency to locate the problem with human beings so deep, so constitutional, so prior to anything that could be addressed by will or choice or effort, that the whole structure of moral life quietly collapsed into a waiting room. You wait for grace. You confess that you need it. And in the meantime, you live more or less the way you lived before. Because what else can you do? Pelagius thought you could do more. He thought the entire tradition of Christian moral teaching was built on the premise that you could do more. And he thought the version of the faith that had settled into the comfortable houses of Rome had quietly abandoned that premise without admitting it had done so. He was right about the problem. The question that would define the rest of his life was whether his solution to it was actually a solution, or whether it was a different version of the same mistake. Because there was a man in North Africa who had read the same Bible Pelagius had read, had prayed to the same God, had thought harder and longer about the moral life of human beings than almost anyone alive, and had come to a conclusion that was not just different from Pelagius's but structurally incompatible with it. Augustine of Hippo had spent years trying to choose the good and failing, not because he did not know what the good was, not because he lacked the information or the example or the motivation. He had all of those things and still failed. For years. In ways that cost him and the people around him real damage. And out of that experience, he had built a theology that began not with what God commands, but with what human beings actually are. And what he believed human beings actually are was the thing that Pelagius's entire framework could not accommodate. Augustine of Hippo wrote the most famous autobiography in the history of the Western world. And the most important thing about it is that it is not really about what happened to him. It is about what happened inside him. The Confessions, written somewhere around the year 397, covers the first 33 years of Augustine's life. It covers his childhood in the North African town of Thagaste, his education in Carthage, his years as a teacher of rhetoric in Rome and then Milan, his long involvement with Manichaeism, his relationships, his ambition, and finally his conversion to Christianity in a garden in Milan in the summer of 386. All of that is in there, in enough detail that historians have been able to reconstruct a fairly complete picture of his early life. But the events are not the point. The events are the surface. What Augustine is actually doing in the Confessions is something that had never quite been done before, in the same way he is trying to describe the interior of a human life, with enough precision to show how a person can know what is right, and still not do it. Can want to be different, and still not become different. Can pray for change and still find himself, year after year, pulled back toward the same patterns he has been praying to leave behind. He is trying to describe a specific kind of failure, and he is trying to describe it not as an embarrassing personal quirk, but as evidence of something structural about what human beings are. The most famous line in the Confessions is probably not the one that stopped Pelagius. It is an earlier one. From the very first page, Augustine is addressing God directly, the way the whole book does. And he writes, "You made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." That line has been quoted so many times in so many contexts that it has acquired a kind of comfortable familiarity. The sort of thing you might find stitched on something in a gift shop. But read it in the context of what comes after it, and it is not comfortable at all. It is a diagnosis. It is Augustine saying that the restlessness he is about to describe for 300 pages is not a personal failing. It is a feature of the human condition. We are built with a longing that nothing in the created world can fully satisfy, and we spend most of our lives trying to satisfy it with things that cannot do the job. And the trying produces a particular kind of exhaustion that looks, from the outside, like a series of bad decisions, but is, from the inside, something more like a hunger that does not know its own name. Augustine knew what he was hungry for long before he could admit it. He was brilliant, educated, ambitious, and by the standards of his world, reasonably successful. He had a partner he had been with for over a decade, a son he loved, a career that was moving in the right direction. He also had a mother, Monica, who had been praying for his conversion to Christianity since before he was old enough to understand what she was praying for, and whose prayers he spent most of his young adulthood treating as a form of affectionate interference. He knew Christian teaching well enough to argue with it. He had read widely enough to know its philosophical weaknesses. He had spent years with the Manichaeans, who offered him a framework for understanding evil that he found intellectually satisfying in ways Christianity did not yet satisfy him. If there is a good God, and the world contains evil, the Manichaean answer was that there are two principles at work, one good and one evil, and the material world belongs largely to the second one. It is clean. It is logical. It means the struggle you feel inside yourself is not your fault but a cosmic drama playing out through you. He eventually found it insufficient. Not wrong in every particular, but insufficient. In the way that a map of a neighborhood is insufficient when you need to navigate a continent. It explained some things and left the most important ones dark. What brought him toward Christianity was not a single argument or a single moment, but a slow accumulation of pressure from multiple directions. The preaching of Ambrose in Milan, his reading of Neoplatonic philosophy, which gave him a way of thinking about God that his earlier frameworks had not. The example of people he knew who seemed to have found something he had not. And underneath all of it, the persistent, inarguable fact of his own experience, which was that he had been trying for years to become someone he respected, and was not succeeding. And the failure was not for lack of trying. He writes about this in language that is almost clinical in its precision. He knew what he wanted. He wanted to live differently. He wanted to be free of the patterns he had been locked into, the appetites that governed him in ways his reason could observe, but not correct. He had the knowledge. He had, in some sense, the desire. What he did not have was the ability to translate desire into sustained action. Something in him kept pulling him back. not a separate force, not a Manichaean evil principle working against him from outside, but something inside his own will, a division in himself that he could feel but could not reach. The line that came to represent this experience to later readers is the prayer he describes offering before his conversion: Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. It is usually quoted as a joke, a clever acknowledgement of the gap between aspiration and readiness. Read it the way Augustine meant it, and it is not a joke at all. It is the most honest thing a person can say about a certain kind of failure. He is not saying he does not want to change. He is saying that the part of him that wants to change and the part of him that is not ready to change are not the same part, and he does not know how to make them work together. And he has been unable to figure this out despite years of genuine effort. His conversion in the garden in Milan in 386 is usually described as a moment of sudden clarity. And in some ways it was. He heard a child's voice telling him to pick up and read. He opened Paul's letter to the Romans and read a passage about putting on Christ and making no provision for the desires of the flesh. Something shifted. Not the desires, not immediately, but something in the weight of the thing. The restlessness that had been running him for 33 years stopped, or began to stop. Not because he had figured out the right answer, but because something had moved in him that he had not moved himself. That experience was the foundation of everything Augustine would ever think about grace. He did not conclude from it that he had finally found the right argument. He concluded that argument was not the mechanism by which the deepest change in a human being occurs. He had known the right arguments for years. He had been able to make them better than most people around him, and he had still been unable to live by them. Because knowing and wanting and being able are three different things. And the gap between the second and the third is not a gap that knowledge or effort can reliably close. What closed it, in his experience, was something that came from outside him. Not information, not a better argument, not a stronger act of will. Something that acted on his will before his will had chosen to act. That moved in him at a level deeper than conscious decision. That changed not just what he knew, but what he wanted. He called it grace, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant. By the time Pelagius arrived in Rome and began teaching that human beings had the natural capacity to choose the good, Augustine had been a bishop for several years and had been thinking about these questions for the better part of 2 decades. He had written about them, preached about them, argued about them with former Manichaeans and with Donatists, and with every variety of theological opponent that the endlessly fractious North African church could produce. He was not, when he first heard about Pelagius, particularly alarmed. The early references suggest a kind of watchful curiosity rather than hostility. Here was a serious man, clearly, with serious moral commitments, teaching about the Christian life in Rome. Augustine sent him what amounted to a collegial letter, careful and respectful. But he was reading what Pelagius was writing, and the more he read, the more he felt something he had felt only a few times in his intellectual life, the specific unease that comes from recognizing that someone has built a very coherent structure on a foundation that is not there. The foundation that was not there was, in Augustine's view, a realistic account of what the human will actually is. Pelagius had built his entire framework on the premise that the human will, properly informed and properly motivated, could choose the good, that God's commands were evidence of human capacity, because a just God would not command the impossible, that the distance between what a person is and what God calls them to be is a distance that human effort, supported by divine assistance, can cross. Augustine read that and thought, he has never really watched himself fail. This is not a dismissal. It is a very precise observation. Pelagius was a man of extraordinary discipline, and extraordinary discipline has a way of creating a certain kind of blind spot. If you have trained yourself to the point where you can reliably do what your will directs, You may not have access to the experience of willing something completely and still not being able to do it. You may intellectually acknowledge that other people have this experience without being able to feel from the inside what it means, and if you cannot feel it from the inside, you will tend to explain it in ways that locate the problem in insufficient effort or insufficient information rather than in something constitutional about the will itself. Pelagius explained it that way. He had to. His entire system depended on it. Augustine's entire system depended on something else. It depended on the possibility that the will itself, not just the information available to the will or the effort the will could muster, but the will at its root, was not neutral, was not a scale waiting to be tipped by the right argument, was something that had been oriented by nature and by habit and by something older than personal history, away from what it most needed and toward what it most wanted in the short term, and that reorienting it was not a task the will could perform on itself. For the same reason that a hand cannot pick itself up, he had a name for what had done this to the will. He had a story for how it had happened, and the story was one that Pelagius had also read, had also thought about, and had drawn from it conclusions so different from Augustine's that when the two interpretations finally collided in public, the collision would shake the entire Christian world. The name was Adam, the story was the garden, and the question of what exactly happened there, and what it meant for everyone born afterward, was about to become the most consequential theological dispute in the history of the Western Church. There is a question buried inside the story of Adam and Eve that most people who know the story have never had to answer directly, because it is the kind of question that only becomes urgent when someone forces it into the open. The question is this: what exactly did Adam pass on? Everyone who has read Genesis knows that something went wrong in the garden. Adam and Eve were given a command. They broke it. Things changed. The world became harder, more painful, more mortal. There is broad agreement on that much across virtually every tradition that has engaged with the text. The disagreement, when it comes, is not about what happened. It is about what it means for the people who came after. Pelagius had an answer to this that was, in his view, the most straightforward reading of the story available. Adam sinned. His sin had consequences. For himself, and for the world he inhabited, and for the people who came after him, those consequences were real and serious. Death entered human experience. The world became more difficult to live in rightly, and human beings inherited from Adam something that made the moral life harder than it would otherwise have been. They inherited his example. They inherited his habits, passed down through the accumulated weight of human culture and upbringing. They inherited a world already bent in the wrong direction. But they did not inherit his guilt. They did not inherit his sin in any meaningful legal or moral sense. Because sin is an act of the will, and the will is individual. You cannot commit someone else's sin the way you cannot perform someone else's action. Adam's choice was Adam's choice. It made things harder for everyone who came after him, but it did not make them guilty for something they had not done. And it did not damage their nature in any way that removed from them the capacity to choose differently. This reading had a clarity to it that Pelagius valued. It preserved the moral seriousness of human life by preserving human responsibility. If Adam's sin is genuinely yours in some inherited, constitutional sense, then your sin is not fully yours either. And the whole structure of moral accountability begins to lean in a direction that makes it hard to stay upright. You cannot meaningfully blame someone for something they were born into, any more than you can blame someone for their height. Augustine read the same story and arrived somewhere else entirely. His key text was a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans, the 5th chapter, verses 12 through 21. Paul is drawing a contrast between Adam and Christ, between what Adam's action brought into the world and what Christ's action reversed. He writes that sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin. and so death spread to all people, because all sinned. The Latin translation that Augustine worked from rendered one phrase in a way that made a very specific claim: death spread to all people, in whom, meaning in Adam, all sinned. The interpretation Augustine built on that phrase was that the entirety of the human race was, in some real sense, present in Adam at the moment of the fall, and participated in what happened there in a way that made what happened there genuinely theirs. Not metaphorically, not culturally, biologically, generationally, in the transmission of life itself. Something had been passed on that was not just a bad example or a harder world, but an actual wound to human nature. He called it original sin, and he meant something precise by it. He did not mean that every human being was born guilty of Adam's specific act. He meant that every human being was born with a will already oriented away from God, already curled inward toward itself, already caught in a pattern of desire that reached for the wrong things with a persistence that could not be explained by bad upbringing or insufficient information alone. The will was wounded, not destroyed, not removed, still free, in the sense that it still chose, still acted, still could be held responsible for what it did, but free the way a compass is free when it has been near a magnet too long. It still moves, still points, but it no longer points true north. The practical test case that Augustine kept returning to was one that Pelagius found deeply uncomfortable, because it was very hard to argue with, and because it involved people who could not speak for themselves. Enfant baptism. By the late 4th century, the practice of baptizing infants was widespread in the Church. It had not always been so universal, and its theological meaning was not entirely settled, but it was common. And it was practiced precisely because the Church had the instinct, however unarticulated, that even newborns needed something that baptism provided. Augustine pressed on that instinct. If human beings are born neutral, as Pelagius arget, if they arrive in the world with their wills intact and their nature undamaged, what exactly does an infant need to be baptized from? What sin does a baby carry? Pelagius's answer was that baptism was about incorporation into the community of Christ, not about the removal of guilt. It was an initiation, not a rescue. Augustine heard that answer and found it inadequate in a way that was almost visceral. The Church baptizes infants because it knows, at a level deeper than doctrinal formulation, that human beings do not arrive in the world morally clean. Something is wrong from the beginning. Something is present that needs to be addressed. The practice of infant baptism is not a theological argument. It is the Church's instinct about human nature expressed in water and prayer. And that instinct, Augustine believed, was pointing at something true. Pelagius thought Augustine was reading too much into a ritual whose meaning was still being worked out. He thought the instinct Augustine was appealing to was itself the product of exactly the kind of thinking he was arguing against, a pre-theoretical assumption that humanity was broken in ways that went deeper than choice, smuggled into Church practice and then used as evidence for the assumption. The debate might have stayed at the level of competing theological interpretations for longer than it did if the world around it had not changed so dramatically in the summer of 410. In August of that year, Alaric and his Visigoth army entered Rome through the Salarian Gate. For 3 days, they moved through a city that had not been taken by a foreign force in 800 years. They took what they wanted, they burned what they chose to burn, and then they left, taking with them not only gold and silver and Roman captives, but something that could not be inventoried, the idea that Rome was permanent. The shock of that event traveled through the Christian world like a wave through water. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described it as the end of everything. Refugees from Rome spread across North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean carrying stories of what they had seen. The question that ran underneath all of it, the question that the pagan critics of Christianity were already asking loudly was whether the empire had been weakened by its conversion, whether a faith that taught humility and otherworldliness and the unimportance of earthly things had produced a civilization less capable of defending itself than the old one had been. Augustine would spend 13 years writing his answer to that question in a work called The City of God. But in the immediate aftermath of Rome's fall, the theological stakes of the Pelagian controversy shifted in a way that neither man had planned for. Because the fall of Rome was, among other things, a moral catastrophe. And moral catastrophes raise the question of moral responsibility in ways that make abstract theological debates suddenly very concrete. Pelagius, arriving in North Africa after the sack of Rome with a stream of other refugees, looked at the devastation and saw what he had always seen, people who had been told they could not help being what they were, living down to that expectation, and producing, collectively, a world that reflected the accumulated weight of individual choices. The fall of Rome was not a mystery. It was the predictable result of a civilization that had been using theological passivity as cover for moral laziness. Augustine looked at the same devastation and saw something else. He saw what happens when human beings are left to their own devices. He saw what the unassisted human will produces when it is given the resources and the opportunity that Rome had been given. He saw not evidence that people had failed to try hard enough, but evidence of how deep the problem went, how far below the level of trying it was rooted, how much more than effort would be required to address it. Two men, looking at the ruins of the same city, seeing completely different things, and both of them about to carry what they saw into an argument that would decide, for centuries, how the Christian world understood what human beings are. There is a word that both men used constantly, that appears on nearly every page of everything they wrote during the years of their conflict, that was at the center of every council and every condemnation and every letter that passed between their respective camps across 2 decades of increasingly bitter dispute. The word is grace. And the reason the dispute lasted as long as it did, the reason it consumed so much of Augustine's remaining life and ended Pelagius's career entirely, is not that they disagreed about whether grace existed. They both believed in it. They both preached it. They both built their understanding of the Christian life around it. The reason the dispute was irresolvable is that when they used the word, they meant something so different that the agreement on the surface concealed a disagreement underneath that was total. Pelagius believed in grace the way a person believes in the tools they have been given to do a job. Grace, in his framework, was comprehensive and real and absolutely essential. But it was essential the way a well-equipped workshop is essential to a craftsman. God had given human beings free will. That was grace. God had given them the law, which told them how to live. That was grace. God had sent prophets and teachers to guide them. That was grace. God had sent Christ, who not only taught the highest possible standard of human living, but demonstrated it in a single human life, showing that it was possible. That was grace. God had offered forgiveness for sins already committed, removing the weight of the past and clearing the way for a new beginning. That was grace. God had promised the resurrection, which gave the whole project of moral seriousness an endpoint and a meaning. That was grace. Put it all together and you have a God who has done an extraordinary amount to make it possible for human beings to live well. Who has, in fact, done everything that an outside party could do to equip a free agent to make good choices. The rest is up to the free agent. Augustine read this account of grace and felt something close to despair. Not because it was wrong about what God had done. Everything Pelagius listed was real. The law existed. Christ had come. Forgiveness was available. The resurrection was promised. Augustine did not dispute any of that. What he disputed was the word Pelagius had not said. The word that, in Augustine's view, explained why all of those externally provided goods were not enough. The word that explained why a person could know the law and still not keep it, could have the example of Christ before them and still not follow it, could have been forgiven and still return to the same patterns, could believe in the resurrection and still live as though this life were the only one that mattered. The word was want. The problem of the human will, Augustine had concluded from his own experience, and from his reading of Paul, and from 2 decades of watching human beings up close as a bishop, was not primarily a problem of knowledge or opportunity. It was a problem of desire. The will follows what it loves. It moves toward what it wants most deeply, at the level below argument and decision, at the level where the real motivations live. And what the fallen human will wants most deeply, left to itself, is not God, is not holiness, is not even the good it acknowledges with its mind. It wants what it has always wanted, what it has been trained by years of habit and by something older than habit to want itself. Its comfort, its continuation, the things that feel like satisfaction even when they are not. Knowing that you should want something different does not change what you want. Having a better example before you does not change what you want. Being forgiven for the consequences of what you wanted does not change what you want. All of the grace that Pelagius described was real, and none of it touched the thing that most needed touching, which was the wanting itself. What Augustine believed grace had to be, if it was going to be adequate to the actual problem, was something that worked at the level of desire. Something that did not just inform the will, or equip the will, or clear the way for the will, but that moved the will. That changed not just what a person knew or could do, but what they loved. That reached into the part of a human being that is prior to conscious decision and reoriented it towards something it had not been able to orient itself toward alone. He had a name for this. He called it operative grace. Grace that operates in us, not just with us or around us. Grace that is not assistance offered to an already functioning moral agent, but transformation applied to an agent whose moral functioning has been compromised at its root. The question that Pelagius's people asked in response to this was immediate and obvious, and it was a good question. If grace works at the level of desire, if it moves the will before the will chooses to move, then in what sense is the choice still free? In what sense is a will that has been moved by grace making a genuine choice, rather than simply going where it has been pointed? Augustine's answer to this was one of the most carefully constructed arguments of his career, and also one of the most contested. He said that the will moved by grace is not thereby coerced. That freedom is not the same as indifference, as the ability to go equally in either direction. That a will genuinely oriented toward the good is more free, not less, because it is doing what it is most fundamentally for. The way a bird in flight is not less free because it is doing what its nature most fully enables, rather than more free when it is struggling against a current that is working against everything it was built for. Pelagius found this distinction less convincing than Augustine did. If grace determines the direction of the will before the will acts, then the outcome is determined by grace, and human responsibility becomes, at best, a secondary phenomenon. The person who does good does so because grace moved them to. The person who does evil does so because grace did not move them to do otherwise. And at that point, the moral universe that Pelagius had built his entire life around, the universe in which commands have meaning because they can be obeyed, in which failure has consequences because it reflects genuine choice, in which the call to holiness is a real call and not a theatrical performance, begins to come apart. This is where Julian of Eclanum entered the picture, and where the argument got sharper and more personal than either of the original combatants had perhaps intended. Julian was young, brilliant, combative, and entirely without Augustine's reluctance to say out loud what everyone was thinking. He had been a bishop in southern Italy, had refused to sign the condemnation of Pelagius in 418, and had consequently lost his position and spent the rest of his career in a kind of permanent theological exile, moving from city to city and continuing to argue with Augustine in writing with an intensity that did not diminish with the years. What Julian said to Augustine, directly and without diplomatic softening, was this: "Your doctrine of original sin is not Christianity. It is Manichaeism with a Christian vocabulary." The charge was pointed because it was aimed at Augustine's past. Before his conversion, Augustine had spent 9 years as a Manichaean, a member of a sect that divided the universe between a good God and an evil principle and located the material world, including the human body and its desires, firmly in the territory of the second one. He had left Manichaeism behind. He believed he had left it behind completely. But Julian's argument was that the shadow of it remained in his theology, in the way he talked about the body and its desires as something fundamentally disordered, in the way he connected the transmission of original sin to sexual reproduction, in the deep suspicion of natural human appetite that ran through his later writings. Augustine denied it. At length and with considerable heat, he insisted that he was not saying the body was evil, not saying that desire was evil in itself, not saying anything that the Manichaeans would have recognized as their own. What he was saying was that desire had been disordered, that what was natural to human beings in their original created state had become distorted in ways that made it unreliable as a guide, and that this distortion was the wound that grace needed to heal. But Julian pressed the point in a way that Augustine found genuinely difficult to answer without conceding something he did not want to concede. If desire is disordered, if the natural appetites of the human body are not trustworthy, if even the desire for good things has been compromised by the fall, then what exactly does God take responsibility for in creating human beings this way? Is God the author of a nature so wounded that it cannot help but fail? And if so, what does that say about the God who is supposed to be perfectly good? Augustine's response to this was the most carefully argued and the most personally revealing writing of his later career. He was not, he insisted, saying that God had made human beings broken. He was saying that human beings had broken themselves at the beginning, and that the brokenness had been passed on, and that God's response to this was not to shrug, but to enter the situation and repair it from the inside, at a cost that only the incarnation and crucifixion made visible. But he also said something that Julian and Pelagius, and everyone who has followed in their tradition since, found deeply troubling. He said that not everyone received the grace that healed the will, that some were given it and some were not, that the giving was not based on merit, because there was no merit prior to grace, and that the not giving was not injustice, because all human beings deserved condemnation, and any who were saved by a mercy they had not earned and could not claim. This is the doctrine of predestination, and Augustine did not arrive at it eagerly or early. He arrived at it the way a person arrives at a conclusion they have been resisting for a long time, when they finally realize that every other path leads somewhere worse. If grace is what he believed it was, if it operates at the level of desire before the will chooses, then the question of who receives it cannot be answered by pointing to human choice or human merit or human anything. It has to be answered by pointing to God, and a God who gives life-transforming grace to some and not others is a God who has chosen, and the choosing is what predestination means. He wrote about this in the last years of his life, with the weariness of a man who has spent decades following an argument wherever it went, and is not entirely comfortable with where it has gone, but who cannot find the place where the argument went wrong. On the Predestination of the Saints, written around 428, 2 years before his death, is not a triumphant document. It is the document of a man still working, still pressing, still trying to say something true about a mystery that kept revealing new edges the closer he got to it. Pelagius, by this point, had been gone from the public stage for a decade, condemned, exiled, erased from the official record of the Church in ways that made it almost impossible to hear his voice except through the writings of the people who had defeated him. But the question he had asked was still there, had always been there, would be there long after Augustine himself was gone. If God commands, can human beings obey? Augustine's final answer was something like this: yes, but only because God first gives them the wanting to. The command and the capacity to fulfill it are both gifts. Neither is something a human being generates from within themselves. The wanting to be good, the choosing of good, the persisting in good over time, all of it is grace. From the first movement of the will toward God to the last breath of a life lived in His direction. There is no moment that is purely human achievement, standing on its own, independent of a love that is always prior. This is what Pelagius could not accept, not because he was a bad man or a dishonest one or someone who did not care about grace. He cared about it deeply. He had built his life around it. But he had built his life around a version of it that left room for the human being to stand. At some essential point in the process, on their own 2 feet, and choose. And Augustine's answer was that the standing itself was grace, that the 2 feet were grace, that the choosing was grace, that there was no point in the process where a human being was operating independently of a love they had not first received. One of them was right, or neither of them was, or they were both gesturing at something true from different angles that the available language could not hold simultaneously. 1,500 years of Christian theology have not settled the question, probably because the question is not the kind that gets settled. It is the kind that has to be lived with, argued about, returned to, because it concerns something about human experience that does not resolve cleanly in either direction. What settled in the early 5th century was not the question. What settled was the power, and what happened to power, and to Pelagius. In the years that followed the argument's peak, is a different kind of story than the one we have been telling. It is a story about what institutions do when an idea threatens not just their theology, but their architecture. In the year 415, in the city of Diospolis in Palestine, Pelagius stood before a council of bishops and defended himself against charges of heresy. He won. The bishops at Diospolis listened to the accusations brought against him, listened to his responses, and voted to acquit him. They declared that the man standing before them was orthodox, that his teaching was compatible with the faith of the Church, that the charges against him had not been sustained. They were not fools or lightweights. They were the senior church leadership of Palestine, men with theological training and institutional experience. And they looked at Pelagius and found no heretic. Augustine received word of the verdict and understood immediately that the battle had just changed shape. He had been corresponding about Pelagius for years by this point, building a case in writing that he was circulating among the bishops of North Africa and beyond. The acquittal at Diospolis did not shake his confidence in his theological position. It shook his confidence that the theological position alone would be sufficient to win. Pelagius had walked into a room full of bishops and convinced them, face to face, that he was sound. That was a problem that arguments and letters could not solve. What followed over the next 3 years is one of the most instructive sequences in the history of how institutions resolve disputes that are too important to leave to the merits. Augustine moved on multiple fronts simultaneously. He continued writing, producing treatise after treatise that articulated the problems with Pelagian theology in more and more precise terms. He preached. He corresponded with bishops across North Africa, building consensus, making the case that the acquittal at Diospolis had been a mistake, that the bishops there had not fully understood what they were dealing with, that the question was not just about Pelagius, the individual, but about a way of thinking about grace and human nature that was incompatible with the faith as Augustine understood it. In 416, 2 councils of North African bishops, at Carthage and at Milev, condemned Pelagianism. They wrote to Pope Innocent I in Rome asking for his confirmation of the condemnation. Innocent, who had not been present at Diospolis and had not heard Pelagius speak, confirmed it. He also took the occasion to make a broader point about the primacy of Rome in settling disputes of this kind, a point that would have its own long history in the centuries that followed. Innocent died in 417 and was succeeded by Zosimus, who was a problem. Zosimus received Pelagius's own written defense and was persuaded by it. He wrote to the North African bishops with something close to rebuke, telling them they had acted too hastily, that Pelagius was a sound man, that the matter needed to be reconsidered. The North African Church, led in practice by Augustine and his colleagues, held firm. They doubled down on their condemnation. They appealed not to the theological argument but to the emperor. This is the moment the story changes register, because what had been a dispute between theologians, adjudicated by church councils, now became a matter of imperial policy. The Emperor Honorius, governing from Ravenna, had reasons of his own to want stability in the church. Religious controversy was politically expensive. Unified condemnation from the North African bishops, who represented a significant portion of the Western Church, was more politically useful to him than the uncertain situation that Zosimus's reconsideration had created. In April of 418, Honorius issued an imperial rescript. Pelagius and Caelestius and their followers were condemned as disturbers of the peace. They were to be expelled from Rome. The rescript preceded the theological settlement, not followed it. The empire moved before the council reconvened. Zosimus, facing the combined pressure of imperial authority and North African episcopal solidarity, reversed himself. He issued a condemnation of Pelagius that was now aligned with both Rome's political interest and North Africa's theological campaign. The Council of Carthage in 418 produced a series of canons against Pelagian positions that became the official statement of Western Christianity on the questions of original sin, grace, infant baptism, and human nature. Pelagius disappeared. This is not a metaphor. After 418, there is no reliable record of him. We do not know where he went when he was expelled. We do not know when he died or where. We do not know if he continued to write, if he found communities willing to harbor him, if he recanted or stood firm or simply stopped being visible enough to leave a trace. The historical record, which has difficulty losing track of significant figures in the late Roman world, loses him completely. What survives of his actual writing is fragmentary and often uncertain, because the process of his condemnation included the suppression of his texts. What we know of his theology comes substantially from Augustine's description of it, which is the description of an opponent written for the purpose of refutation. It is not nothing. Augustine was a careful enough thinker to represent positions accurately before arguing against them. But it is not the same as hearing Pelagius in his own voice, making his own argument, without the frame that his most dedicated enemy built around it. Julian of Eclanum refused to sign the condemnation of 418 and was removed from his bishopric. He spent the following decades in exile, continuing to write against Augustine with an energy that suggested he found exile preferable to capitulation. He appealed to councils, to bishops, to Theodore of Mopsuestia in the east, to anyone who might listen. He was not restored. He died around 455, still outside the official church, still arguing. Augustine never quite let the argument go either. After 418, after the condemnation had been settled and the political question had been resolved and Pelagius had vanished from the scene, he kept writing the treatises from his final years, on grace and free will, on rebuke and grace, on the predestination of the saints, on the gift of perseverance, were not written against a living opponent who still had institutional standing. They were written against a question that would not stay answered just because the person who had asked it most publicly had been removed from the room. Because removing Pelagius from the room was not the same as answering what Pelagius had asked. And Augustine knew this. He had always known it. The question of whether human beings could choose the good was not Pelagius's question. It was everyone's question. It was the question that anyone who had ever tried to live seriously and failed had asked in one form or another. Condemning the man who had formulated it most clearly did not make the question go away. It just meant there was no longer an officially recognized voice willing to argue the uncomfortable side of it. What the condemnation of Pelagius produced, in the official theology of the Western Church, was a settlement, a formal position on original sin, on grace, on the necessity of baptism, on the priority of divine action in human salvation. That position, substantially shaped by Augustine, became the foundation on which medieval Catholic theology was built, on which the Reformers reacted in ways that sometimes amplified Augustine further than Augustine himself had gone, on which 5 centuries of Protestant and Catholic controversy about grace and works and faith and merit played out. It was an enormous settlement. It shaped the moral imagination of an entire civilization in ways that are still visible if you know where to look. And underneath it, never fully resolved, never fully silent, the question kept moving, not as Pelagianism. That word had become a label for a position so thoroughly condemned that to be associated with it was to be associated with something already decided, already outside the boundary, already wrong before you had finished making your argument. Semi-Pelagianism, the attempt to find a middle ground between Pelagius and Augustine, was condemned at the Council of Orange in 529. The official position held. But the question was not the same thing as the label. The question was whether human beings, in their actual nature, had the genuine capacity to respond to what God asked of them, or whether even that capacity was itself a gift that arrived from outside. It was the question that Thomas Aquinas wrestled with in the 13th century in ways that tried to find more room for human nature than Augustine's later writings allowed. It was the question that Erasmus raised against Luther in the 16th century, when Luther pushed Augustinian predestination further than most Western Christians had been willing to go. It was the question that the Council of Trent tried to navigate in the 16th century, and that the Jansenist controversy reopened in the 17th, and that has never been fully put to rest in any branch of Christianity that takes both human responsibility and divine sovereignty seriously. Pelagius was erased. The question he carried was not, and Augustine, in the last years of his life, sitting in a city under siege by a force that would destroy it within a year of his death, kept writing about grace, kept pressing the argument, kept trying to say something true about a mystery that resisted the precision he brought to it, that kept opening new rooms every time he thought he had found the last one. He was not writing for Pelagius anymore. Pelagius was gone. He was writing for the question, because he understood, with the clarity that comes to a person near the end of a long life of serious thought, that the question was going to outlast both of them. He was right. Augustine died in the summer of 430. He had been Bishop of Hippo for 35 years. He had written more than 5 million words. A volume of output that remains almost incomprehensible even by the standards of people who do nothing but write. He had preached thousands of sermons, conducted hundreds of councils, managed the administrative life of a North African diocese through decades of political upheaval, theological controversy, and the slow, visible collapse of the empire that had given the Church the stability it had used to build itself into what it was. He died while the Vandals were outside the walls of his city. He had been watching them come for months. He had watched them move through North Africa, city by city. And he had watched the world he had spent his life thinking and writing inside of come apart at its physical edges. Friends had written to him asking whether bishops should flee when the barbarians came or stay with their congregations. He had written back that they should stay. He stayed. He died on August 28th, 430. Before the Vandals took the city. Hippo held for another 14 months after his death and then fell. The city was largely destroyed. The library that held his manuscripts survived, which is why we have them. He did not die with the feeling of a man who had finished something. The last major works he was still revising in his final years were the ones about grace and predestination, the ones that pressed hardest on the questions Pelagius had forced into the open. He was writing on the predestination of the saints and on the gift of perseverance in 428 and 429, less than 2 years before his death. These were not works of consolidation. They were works of a man still pressing, still finding new edges on questions he had been living with for decades, still unable to arrive at a place that felt completely settled. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Pelagius had been gone from the public stage for over a decade. The institutional question had been resolved. The councils had spoken. The emperor had acted. The condemnation was on the books. There was no live opponent left to argue with. No synod threatening to reverse the verdict. No political crisis requiring a theological response. By every external measure, Augustine had won, and he was still writing about grace. Not because someone was making him, not because the fight was still being fought in any official sense, but because he understood something that the process of condemnation had obscured. Winning an argument and answering a question are not the same thing. The councils had decided who was right. They had not resolved what was true. And Augustine, who cared more about what was true than about who was right, could not stop pushing on the places where the truth he had defended still resisted clean articulation. The place that resisted most was the one Pelagius had always pressed on. If grace is prior to human choice, if the wanting to be good is itself a gift before it is a decision, then what is human freedom for? Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical category, but in the concrete life of a specific person trying to live well. What do you do with the fact that you chose, that it felt like a choice, that you deliberated and decided and acted, if the outcome was in some sense already secured by a grace that moved before you did? Augustine never found a way to say this that fully satisfied him. His arguments were careful and serious and the product of a lifetime of thought. And they still left a residue of unresolved tension that he acknowledged more in his later writings than in his earlier ones. He had the intellectual honesty to follow his argument to its conclusions, and the spiritual honesty to sit with the discomfort of conclusions that could not be made entirely comfortable. What he left behind was not an answer. It was a framework, a way of holding the question that had enough structure to be built on, enough precision to be argued with, enough honesty to acknowledge that it was not the last word. The question itself moved on without him. It moved first through the monasteries of southern Gaul, where a group of monks who had enormous respect for Augustine and genuine discomfort with his doctrine of predestination tried to find a middle position. They were called semi-Pelagians by their opponents, a label that was not entirely fair to the nuance of what they were actually arguing. But labels in theological controversy are rarely fair. They believed that human beings could take the first step toward God, could have an initial turning of the will toward grace, and that grace would then meet and complete that turning. They were trying to preserve both human responsibility and divine priority, and they were trying to do it in a way that did not require them to say that some people were simply not given the grace to be saved. The Council of Orange in 529 condemned this position as well. The Western Church doubled down on Augustine. Grace is prior. The first movement is God's. Human beings do not initiate. They respond. And the response itself is enabled by what God has already done. That was the official position. It remained the official position of Western Christianity, in various forms, for 1,000 years. And then, in the 16th century, a German monk named Martin Luther read Augustine. Luther read him with the intensity of a man who recognized in Augustine's description of the failed human will something he had been living in his own body for years. The monasteries of late medieval Europe had, in Luther's experience, become very Pelagian in practice, if not in official theology. The system of indulgences, of penance, of the accumulation of merit through religious acts, had produced a Christianity in which the human contribution to salvation felt very large, and the grace that was supposed to precede it felt very distant. Luther read Augustine and found the corrective. He pushed it further than Augustine had pushed it, in some directions further than Augustine would have recognized as his own. But the root was Augustinian. Grace alone, faith alone, nothing in the human being that is not first given by God. Erasmus of Rotterdam responded to Luther the way Pelagius had responded to Augustine, not by denying grace but by insisting that a Christianity which removed genuine human freedom from the equation of salvation was a Christianity that could not sustain the moral seriousness it claimed to require. His work, On Free Will, published in 1524, is one of the most careful and underrated documents of the Reformation controversy. And it is recognizably continuous with the tradition that runs back through the semi-Pelagians to Pelagius himself, not in its conclusion, which are more careful, but in its instinct that the dignity of human beings requires that their choices mean something that is genuinely theirs. Luther's response, On the Bondage of the Will, published in 1525, is the most Augustinian document he ever wrote. He called it his best book. He was probably right. And in it, he said something that Augustine had said more carefully, but had still said that if grace is real, it must be prior to human choice, in a way that means human choice is not the decisive variable. That freedom, properly understood, is not the freedom to go either way, but the freedom to be what you most fully are, and that what fallen human beings most fully are, without grace, is not neutral agents who simply need better information, but creatures curved in on themselves in ways they cannot uncurl alone. The argument that Pelagius and Augustine had in the early 5th century was the same argument that Erasmus and Luther had in the 16th. It was the same argument that Arminius and the Calvinist theologians had in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. It was the same argument that the Jansenists brought back into the Catholic Church in the 17th century, reading Augustine with a rigor that Rome eventually found as uncomfortable as it had found Pelagius. It was the same argument, dressed in different language, that runs through every serious attempt to think about what human beings are, what they can do, and what they require from outside themselves to become what they are called to be. It never got settled, because it cannot be settled by argument. It can only be settled by experience. And experience gives different people different answers. The person who has tried to change something deep about themselves and failed, who has brought every resource of will and knowledge and effort to bear, and still found themselves returning to the same place. That person has experienced something that Augustine's framework fits like a key in a lock. The language of wounded will, of desire that will not simply obey reason, of needing something from outside to move what cannot move itself, is not abstract for that person. It is a description of Tuesday, and the person who has changed, who has made a decision and held it and built a different life on the other side of it, who has looked at a pattern they were locked in and found the way out through sustained, deliberate effort over a long period of time. That person has experienced something that Pelagius's framework honors, in a way Augustine's does not always. The language of genuine capacity, of real choice, of a God who asks because asking means something, is not naive for that person. It is a description of what actually happened. Both experiences are real. Both are common. Both resist being explained away by the framework built to account for the other one. And the argument between the two frameworks is not a failure of one side to understand the other. It is the argument pressing up against the actual complexity of what human beings are. which turns out to be more than any single framework can hold without leaving something important out. Augustine knew this. At some level, by the end, the restlessness in his late writings about predestination is not the restlessness of a man who doubts his conclusions. It is the restlessness of a man who has followed the argument to its conclusions and found that the conclusions, while true as far as they go, do not go all the way to the bottom of the thing they are describing. There is always more. There is always a room the argument did not reach, and in that room, if you are quiet enough to hear it, there is still a question. The same question Pelagius asked in Rome, the same question Augustine answered in Hippo, the same question that has been answered and re-answered and answered again across 15 centuries of Christian thought and is still being asked today, in different language, in different rooms, by people who have never heard of either man and are not asking it as a theological question at all. They are asking it the way everyone eventually asks it. In the dark, after something has failed that they needed not to fail, when the distance between who they are and who they know they should be has become impossible to ignore, and the question of whether that distance is crossable, and by what means, and at what cost, and with how much help from outside themselves, is no longer an abstract matter of doctrine. It is the most personal question there is. It always was. Pelagius answered it one way. From a life of discipline that had perhaps not yet required him to test the limits of what discipline could do, Augustine answered it another way. From a life that had tested those limits extensively and found them real. Neither of them had access to every experience the question touches. Neither of them could. No single human life is wide enough to hold all of what that question asks. What they left behind was not a resolution. It was a tension. A productive, irreducible tension between two things that are both true in the lives of actual human beings, that we are capable of more than we usually do, and that we cannot always get there alone, that our choices matter, and that something in us makes the right choices harder than they should be, that the call to be better is real and meaningful, and that answering it sometimes requires more than we can generate from within ourselves. Both of those things are true. The argument between Pelagius and Augustine is the argument about which one is more fundamentally true, about which one gets to be the foundation and which one gets to be the qualifier. And the reason it has never been settled is that both of them are right about something that resists being subordinated to the other. Rome is long gone. The empire that condemned Pelagius and then fell anyway has been dust for over 1,000 years. The North African city where Augustine wrote and preached and argued is now a small coastal town in Algeria, and the library that saved his manuscripts is not there anymore. And the church that preserved his condemnation of Pelagius has changed in more ways than either of them could have imagined. But on a Tuesday, in whatever year you are reading this, or hearing this, someone is sitting with the gap between who they are and who they know they should be. Someone is trying to figure out whether they need to try harder or whether trying harder is not, in the end, the variable that matters most. Someone is asking, in the language available to them, the question that a monk from Britain asked in Rome in the late 4th century, and that a bishop in North Africa spent 30 years trying to answer. The question did not die with Pelagius. It did not die with Augustine. It did not die at any of the councils that condemned it or any of the reformations that reframed it. Go back to the sentence that started all of this. The sentence Pelagius heard read aloud in a room in Rome. The prayer Augustine had written from the deepest place in his experience of his own failure and his own rescue. Give me what you command, and command what you will. When you hear that sentence, what does it sound like to you? If it sounds like relief, like someone finally admitting that the weight is real and that you do not have to carry it alone, then you have heard what Augustine heard when he wrote it, what the tradition that preserved him heard when it read it, what millions of people across 15 centuries have heard in it, the sound of grace arriving before you knew to ask for it. If it sounds like an excuse, like a door being left open for the wrong reason, like a prayer that makes it too easy to stop before the work is done. Then you have heard what Pelagius heard when someone else read it aloud. What made him walk out of that room, carrying a question he could not put down? What has made people in every century since push back against the comfort of that sentence and ask whether the God who commands is also a God who expects the commanding to mean something? Both of those responses are honest. Both of them are paying attention to something real. The argument between the man who wrote the sentence and the man who could not accept it is not over. It is in that gap between what you heard and what someone else would hear, reading the same words. It always was.